Hi class, this is Professor Pronte, and the video for this module is on the Roaring Twenties. I don't know about you guys, but what comes to mind for me when I think about the 1920s are all these ways in which our culture was changing. And so before getting to a lot of these economic issues, let's take note of just other notable ways that American culture was changing during the 1920s. One thing that stands out is that in the 1920s, women's rights were improving. Women gained the right to vote in any election in the United States through an amendment to the Constitution. So that's a big deal, obviously, that took place during the 1920s. Women were participating in labor markets at a far higher rate than they had earlier. And this is a little bit subtle because most definitely women were still facing discrimination and not working whatever types of jobs they wanted to during the 1920s. But what I'm meaning to say is that we were seeing improvements here in terms of women having the opportunity to work outside of the home. In addition to these changes to rights for women, we also saw in the 1920s changing laws related to drinking. So at the beginning of the decade, the Constitution was amended to outlaw the consumption and production of alcohol, prohibition, as you might have heard of. And so that was the law of the land for some time, and then later on, in the 30s actually, prohibition was repealed, and so we got rid of that. So you can see then that life was changing dramatically during the 20s. A major event here in the 20s economically is that we saw a rise to the middle class. Lots and lots of people in the US for the first time were able to have access to all sorts of consumer goods they hadn't been able to access before. This is partly because of higher incomes, but also because some of these items were getting cheaper. So especially with things that we call consumer durables, people had increased ability to buy these things. So an average citizen in the 1920s for the first time might be able to buy a refrigerator or a car or a vacuum cleaner. These consumer durables are items that last some time, right? So it's in contrast to something like a movie ticket or a meal or something like that, where it's not going to last as long. The fact that people are buying durable goods like this is important because it goes hand in hand with people being able to buy things on credit. You can borrow money to buy these things. With a durable good, like a car or a refrigerator or something like that, it provides collateral for the person who will be lending that money. And so because the collateral is already sort of baked into the durable good, we saw people using credit for the first time, or at higher rates during the 1920s, and that's kind of an interesting thing as well. So the 1920s saw this new middle class. We saw rising incomes on average. It wasn't all good times, though, for everyone. One group within our economy that was having a hard time in the 20s were farmers. Farmers had a hard time in the 20s because there were a couple factors that came together to work against them. First, we saw that crop prices were falling. Right? So good news for you or me if we're trying to buy food, but that's bad news from the perspective of a farmer who's trying to sell that food. These crop prices were falling dramatically, due in part to the fact that there was a big ramp up in production after and during World War I. So there was a big expansion in the number of farms. And then secondly, during the 1920s, American farmers no longer had this advantage of being able to send so much of their products to Europe, where the war was over at this point. On top of that, a lot of farmers had costs that still remained high, even as these crop prices were falling. As farmers had been trying to expand the size of their operation, they were taking out mortgages, they were buying additional lands, and so as a consequence, are owing money back to banks. These were sunk costs for farmers, meaning that they've already paid them. There's no way for them to reduce their expenditure on these things. They owe the bank no matter what, regardless of what's happening with crop prices. And so when these things come together, I think you can better understand why farmers were having a hard time in the 20s. The stuff they were selling was showing lower prices, but their costs remained up high. And that add those things together, and obviously that's not a recipe for success. Finally, guys, I want you to note that during the 1920s, and especially during the last half of the 1920s, we saw really dramatic increases in the stock market. Not only investors, but also lay people, just ordinary citizens, were beginning to invest in the stock market. And as these stock prices were going up, people had a sense that you couldn't go wrong. Right? As you put in money into the stock market, it was going up almost inevitably, it seemed like. Some numbers do a good job of characterizing this. Between the years 1922 and 1929, the value of that stock market over tripled. If you put $100 in the beginning of the decade, it'd be worth $300 at the end of the decade. And so there was this big increase in the value of the stock market throughout the 1920s. And that's going to be important moving ahead into our next module, a little teaser here, into our next module with the Great Depression. All right, there you go, guys. 4 big ideas I definitely want you to know about related to